Well, that introduction, Bev, uh, isn't really the story. Let me explain why. Because Erdogan has said this before. Because for domestic reasons, he faces re-election next year. He wants to be a guy who gets the settlement between Ukraine and Russia to end the conflict. So he keeps saying, of course, Vladimir will negotiate. Here's the stinger. Erdogan told the U.S. outlet PBS that for there to be a settlement, Russia must withdraw from the territory it has taken since February 24th. That would be significant parts of the south of Ukraine and of the east of the country. Now, of course, Ukraine's beginning to push back on the Russians on those areas. But what Erdogan has done is, far from backing the Russians and saying the occupation can stand, has actually turned against Putin and said, no, you have to withdraw.
Well, that is fascinating. Does that make it less likely that there is significance to the comments that Putin may be ready, because of the way the war is progressing, to consider trying to get out somehow?
I think so, Bev, because at the end of the day, it's really one guy. It's Vladimir Putin, who has to make the decision, look, he's not going to win this conflict. Indeed, he's in risk of losing it in important ways. So now he'll sit down and he'll talk about a way to get out. But he's invested not just his present, but his legacy on conquering much of Ukraine. So when does he put his hands up and say, I haven't achieved that?
Yeah, potentially when the domestic pressure becomes apparent to him. And, you know, we're seeing public statements even from China, even though they are, of course, continuing to buy a lot of oil and keeping that war going to a degree. He doesn't have too many friends on the world stage, Vladimir Putin. And if he's facing domestic pressure, does he start trying to find a dignified, if it's possible, way out?
Well, I think that's the scenario we're looking at, because you're quite right to mention the fact that China very pointedly kept its distance last week, even as President President Putin met Xi Jinping. And the Chinese did not even mention Ukraine in their statement about that meeting. He pretty much is now relying on drones from Iran and munitions from North Korea as his support. But again, I think if you talk to intelligence agencies, I think in Australia, in the US, in Europe, they'll say, look, we can see that Putin is on the back foot and that it's going to turn against him. But given the type of the man, and given that there's no prospect he'll be overthrown within Russia soon, this is going to go on for months.
Yeah. How does the world protest the discovery of this gruesome discovery of mass graves as the Ukraine offensive continues?
Well, what President Vladimir Zelensky would like is for there to be a formal statement that says that Russia is a state sponsor of terrorism. Now, that's not going to happen. This is the nature of diplomacy and power politics. Instead, what the international community is going to say is, look, we want to carry out these investigations to support Ukraine in terms of now not only the mass killings of the civilians in the north, but the ones that we're discovering up in the northeast. And this will go up, for example, through the International Criminal Court, through possibly other courts like the International Court of Justice, as well as through the United Nations. I think while that's going on, because these investigations take time, it's important, not just as analysts, but as human beings, to recognize that you're talking about tens of thousands of civilians who have been murdered, who have been killed during this invasion, and to cut through the Russian disinformation, some of which is repeated in Australia, which says, oh, we have nothing to do with this, it's all NATO's fault. So in other words, never lose sight that the first and foremost responsibility here are the Ukrainians who died or who have suffered because of this aggression.
Yeah. I mean, you know, in these moments, we don't ever believe someone like Putin will be held accountable, but these things sometimes do take their course, and we can't dismiss that concept. Ukraine continues, though, to push east. It is prompting efforts to try and rush through referendums. And, of course, we should remember there are many pro-Russian groups in these areas that are contested.
Well, let's take two things that are happening. The first is, okay, Ukraine is advancing now, has taken more than 8,000 square kilometers of territory in 2 weeks, is gaining not only now in the northeast, it's beginning to push back on the Russian areas that have been occupied since 2014, Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. In response, here's the event you're referring to. Both of those Russian proxy areas are saying, oh, we have to have referenda now to annex ourselves to Russia. And importantly, Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, who's allied with Vladimir Putin, has endorsed that. So what the Kremlin's going to try to do is to say, oh, look, all these people really, really love Russia, and hold these staged referendum, which first of all is coming under military pressure from Ukraine, and secondly, doesn't really reflect the fact that most people in Ukraine are welcoming the liberation of their areas rather than saying we want to remain with Moscow.
Yeah. It is so fascinating to see really how porous the Russian occupation is. It's that real example of people, you know, the side with a purpose and the side that isn't quite sure why it's there.
Because we'll go back to February 24th and the miscalculation behind all of this. This was to be a lightning invasion. The Russian forces were going to go into Kiev, the people in Kiev and in other Ukrainian cities, either because they would greet the liberators with flowers, which is what some Russians thought, or because they had no choice. That would be it. This conflict would be over within weeks. That didn't happen. Vladimir Putin failed to split the international community from Ukraine, and most importantly, he failed to break the will of the Ukrainian people, its military, and its government.
You talk about this war continuing, though, and grinding on. Liz Truss, the new Prime Minister in Britain, has committed the same funding for Ukraine for next year. How essential is it that the Western efforts to support Ukraine continue?
Well, Liz Truss's announcement, which will be made at the United Nations, of course, it's for domestic reasons. She wants to establish herself as the new Prime Minister. But let's not diminish the importance of what's happening between the institutions. Not only the US, the UK, Europe, Australia as well, other countries around the world. Each time even a small amount of military aid is given to Kyiv, it doesn't only bolster their resistance and now their advance against Moscow, it shows that the political will is still there, that people are not getting tired of this conflict and turning away. And I think that's going to be the key message over the winter. You'll hear Vladimir Putin trying to break the will, trying to break the economic and political support by freezing us in Europe. Not going to happen, folks. Basically, Kyiv is on the up in this conflict, and it is supported by most people in the world.
Indeed. Great to talk as always, Scott. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Bev.